Among these slightly less well-known passages of the Haggadah, and sometimes overlooked because it's so short, is a 4-line rhythmic stanza that goes like this in the Hebrew. Vehi she'amda la'avotenu v'lanu, shelo echad bilvad amad aleinu lachalotenu, ela shebechol dor vador omdim aleinu lachalotenu. It is this which has stood by our ancestors and by us. Not just one has stood against us to make an end to us, but in every age many have stood against us to make an end to us, an end of us. Yet the Holy One sustains us despite their power. As with many songs in the Jewish canon that have something of a little bit of an ominous or dark tone, this verse has a jolly and defiant little tune to which it can be sung, which I'm not going to inflict upon you now. At the point in the Seder where it's recited, the rubric requires each participant to raise their cup of wine and cover the matzah. But we're not about to drink another cup of wine. We're halfway between the first and second cup, the first reminding us of God's promise to bring us out of Egypt, the second recalling God's promise to deliver us from Egyptian slavery. At this point of the Seder, when our stomachs may be rumbling and we may be longing to get to the meal, we're reminded that just as God kept faith with Israel and stood by us in times past, so too must we take on this, Vehi she'amda, usually interpreted to mean a little of the trust and patience and faithfulness that our ancestors placed in the Holy One, who is the real source of Israel's survival. But why uncover the matzah here, and why raise your cup? If you analyze the Haggadah, you'll see that the matzah is uncovered when there follows a reference to oppression or affliction. When it's covered, the service breaks into a hymn of praise or thanksgiving to God. At these key moments during the Seder, the Haggadah makes a statement about the need to set aside our consciousness of oppression while taking opportunities to express gratitude to God who has given us life. When I was part of an editorial group some years ago, together with Rabbi Hilton, translating and producing a Haggadah for the Reform movement, I wondered about the negative implications of this particular verse. Not just one has stood against us to make an end of us, but in every age, many have stood against us to make an end to us. It's sometimes felt as though these words reinforced a sense of victimhood among the Jewish people, the feeling that we are constantly being attacked, subject to anti-Semitism and vilification. Not only an Amalek or a Pharaoh or a Haman have risen up to attack us and do away with us, but others as well, it seems to imply, Assyrian, Greek, and Roman emperors and their oppressive decrees against Jews, writers of classical antiquity, whose prejudices are betrayed in the outpourings of Horace, Apion, and Seneca, among others, the early church fathers, whose theology placed the Jews as a rejected people in favor of the new Israel, Christianity. Anti-Jewish feeling erupted in the massacres of the Crusades in northern France and Germany, and the accusation against Jews that they had caused the Black Death, forced conversions, public disputations, book burnings, mob attacks and killings that continued throughout the Middle Ages in Christian Europe and in the Cossack killings in Eastern Europe. Nor was Islam particularly kind to us when Jews refused to embrace the new faith. Jews were given dhimmi status as second-class citizens, required to pay special taxes and wear a yellow star, just as they were in Nazi Europe. Jews were vilified by the blood libel that persisted even until the 19th century. And so it's hardly surprising that these words, certainly from the Haggadah's medieval incarnations, the verse is found in both Saadia Gaon's and Maimonides' Haggadot, persisted and claimed profound meaning for a beleaguered and victimized people. Not just one has stood against us to make an end of us, but in every age. In the last 80 years, the words have resonated profoundly at our Sedarim in the wake of the Shoah. And this year they hold an even greater significance, a more immediate significance, after October the 7th, with the murder of 1,200 Israelis by Hamas terrorists, the capture of 250 women, children, and men, 134 of whom are still in Gaza, and Iran's massive missile and drone attack against Israel on Sunday morning, the 14th of April. Not just one has stood against us to make an end of us. While the Reform Haggadah didn't eliminate the passage, it did include an alternative verse as a kind of counterweight to the original verses' focus on anti-Semitism and victimhood. And so this is added as an alternative. It is humanity's trust in goodness which has sustained the human race. For though we stand against each other to make an end of each other, and though in every age we fail to learn the lessons of war and conflict, new generations bring hope and trust in the eternal God. The two verses sound somewhat similar. They use the same language. They speak of trust and patience, of human enmity and conflict. But the difference is this. In the traditional version, the enemy is objectified. Not just one has stood against us to make an end of us, but in every age, many have stood against us to make an end to us. In other words, those who seek to stand against us and destroy us are out there in every place and in every age. In the alternative version, there is no objective enemy. We stand against each other to make an end of each other. We fail to learn the lessons of war and conflict. We acknowledge the age-old anti-Jewish virus that we are still wrestling with, but we also accept responsibility for our own pugnacious views, for our own biases and resentments. We are not innocents. We can be guilty of inflating anti-Semitism or seeing it where it is not, of turning away from dialogue and encounter. We may not ourselves be guilty of retribution and revenge, but the actions performed in the name of the Jewish people, in the name of the Jewish state, force us to accept responsibility and to own the shame where international law has been overstepped, where the violence of settlers on the West Bank has inflamed a conflict that was already a tinderbox. There's one other aspect of this verse that I'd like to draw your attention to. As I said at the beginning, the opening words of the Hebrews say simply, Vihi she'amda. which means literally, and it has stood by, or she, he means she, has stood by our ancestors and by us. But it doesn't spell out here what the pronoun he refers to. Most translations and commentaries add something like, it's God's promise, or God's trust, havtacha, or God's faithfulness. It's this that has stood by our ancestors and by us in every age, implying that it's God's constancy that has sustained us in the face of oppressive powers. And this feminine pronoun is understood as well to refer to the Shekhinah, the immanent, feminine presence of God, or even to the Torah, another feminine noun. But in a contemporary commentary, in the little booklet that's just been produced since October the 7th, called Seder Interrupted, a post-October the 7th Haggadah supplement, Rabbi Diane Kola-Esses reads V'hi she'amda, not as referring to it, namely God's faithfulness, but as she, and the she here, she interprets as referring to Miriam. Why Miriam? Because, says Rabbi Diane, she stood by while her imperiled baby brother, who was so threatening to Pharaoh that he wanted him dead, was placed by his heartbroken mother in a basket in the reeds by the river Nile. It was Miriam who stood and watched him, waiting, unwilling to abandon him, and at the right moment when Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the Nile with her servant girls, she had the audacity to see the oppressor not simply as an oppressor or less than human, but expected more. She expected humanity, even from her enemy. And when she perceives that this so-called enemy is compassionate and humane, she steps in and dares to speak to the daughter of a Pharaoh as a human being. Shall I go and call a nursing woman from the Hebrews for you, so that she may nurse the child? It is Miriam, says Rabbi Diane, who reunites the child with his mother, and who is the one who stands and watches, who waits in faith for that precise, redemptive moment. It is Miriam, the slave girl, who makes deals for the sake of redemption, who recognizes the humanity of her oppressor, crossing the enemy lines to save life. I can sense her presence, writes Rabbi Diane. Even now, in this shattered moment, Miriam is waiting, watching for just the right moment to step into the human field, into the field of redemption, and save our people. I hope and pray that there are Miriams ready to step in at the right moment, to bring home the hostages still being held in Gaza, the living and the dead. I pray that there are Miriams ready to step in with a strategy, not of retribution and revenge, but of freedom and justice, dialogue and healing, so that the children of future generations can live their lives knowing reconciliation and peace. Amen.